Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're just going to give folks about a minute to join. Some folks are sort of filing in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to this webinar. The topic is Standardizing Payments Information, a Conversation with Nacha. My name is Kirsten Rommel. I'll be your moderator today. A little bit about myself. I'm currently head of product marketing here at Modern Treasury. And in terms of my background, I've spent the past 10 years working in financial services and fintech for companies like American Express, Affirm, and Ripple. Really excited for this conversation today. I think it's going to be super interesting. We are going to touch on a variety of topics, talk about the benefits of payment standardization, challenges that companies have in terms of adopting payment standardization, and then even talk about specific payment standards like ISO 20022 and Nacha's IAT. But before we get started, I want to talk about a few housekeeping items. The first is a PSA, and the PSA is around the fact that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending that recording out to registrants in the following days. Secondly, we really want this webinar to be interactive. So if you have a question that you want to be answered, please pop it into the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try and have our panelists answer many of those questions at the end of the discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. We have Sam Ahrens, our CTO of Modern Treasury, and Amy Morris, a senior director at Nacha. I'll pass it over to them to quickly provide an overview of their backgrounds. So Sam, let's start with you.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Ahrens, co-founder, CTO of Modern Treasury. I lead our engineering and compliance teams. I'm also our resident payments expert. So I love talking about payments, love talking about it publicly, and yeah, excited for today's conversation.
And hi, everybody. I'm Amy Morris. I am with Nacha. I work in our network department, which covers rules and risks and education and all kinds of fun things. I also liaise with our preferred partners and a lot of our different fintech members and Payments Innovation Alliance members, talking about good old ACH rules. I'm also very much a payments geek like Sam. We have some good conversations. Before coming to Nacha, I've been there for 11 years now, but I also have experience in operations, running payments for New Federal Credit Union. I've done some time at FinTech with FIS, as well as some rulemaking with Visa. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about payments with you all.
Awesome. I think this should be a really exciting conversation. We've got 3 payment nerds on the call today. So let's go ahead and kick off the conversation and just talk a little bit about payment standardization more broadly. So the question I have is, at a holistic level, what is payment standardization and why is it important for businesses? So Sam, I'm going to pass it over to you to take a first crack at that.
Yeah, I think payment standardization is a broad term, but encompasses a lot of concrete things. At its very level, standardization is about making sure that the fields and objects that you communicate between two counterparties over a given network are formatted correctly, are in a standardized place inside of a message so that both parties can understand it. And the reason why this is really important is because historically we've come from maybe unstandardized payment messages. So what I mean by that is if I have a certain, let's say I have certain information that I need to send to someone in a payment, more often than not, I'm sending that in a free-form text field that I control, and I can put any information that I want to in there. and if it needs to be structured in some way, or if there's some key elements that need to make it over, like if I'm communicating someone's date of birth, for example, that's something that I just fill in a text field. And standardization, payment standardization, means there's a specific place where I put that information so that both parties understand it. It also means standardization of how I talk to banks. So corporates talking to banks, right now that happens over a variety of different file formats and different standards. Standardization is about kind of unifying that in just a few key ones that you can explain yourself in. But there's also standardization at the bank level. Banks talk to the central bank in whatever country they're in a variety of different formats as well. And so payment standardization is about also making that much more simple and making it much more streamlined. So that's how I would define it. It's a very broad term, but I think throughout this talk we'll maybe add some more concrete color to that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I fully agree with everything that Sam said. I think that my, kind of 10,000-foot definition for payment standardization is parties to a transaction, which that can be financial institutions, as Sam mentioned, senders and receivers, basically agreeing to speak the same language while they're making a payment. And so that can be, as Sam has mentioned, and we're going to focus on today, some of that remittance information, understanding what a payment is for, et cetera. But it also can be around the payment itself. Payment standardization is literally why Nacha exists, because 50 years ago, there were disparate networks within the United States that were starting to exchange electronic files, but they didn't have the full reach. And so Nacha was created to make one standard for everybody in the US, and that brought the interoperability of the whole country together. So again, it's just, why is it important? It's the same reason of being able to communicate and understanding what something is for and what to do with it.
Right. And just the impact on end users when it comes to payment standardization. Can you guys talk a little bit about that? Maybe Sam, you can take that one to start, but does it result in less failed payments? Just talk a little bit about how end users can benefit from standardized payments.
Yeah, there's a lot of benefits. One of them is less failed payments. If the sender and receiver and all the parties involved, like Amy had mentioned, if you all agree on a standard language or a standard interchange format, you're much more likely to have payments sail what we call straight through. So if I'm putting in all the information in a standardized way and I have all the fields in there, especially for international payments, if I send that, it's going to go through each party in the payment process, and everyone is going to be able to understand it the same way. And that's a huge benefit, just efficiency of payments, making sure that there are no failures. There's also an operational complexity that goes down the more standardized you are. So if you speak only a single language to all of your banks, that is a lot simpler of a system to maintain yourself. You only have to maintain, okay, I speak this standard, I speak it to all my banks, they understand it equally well. And so it really cuts down for end users the amount of complexity that you have to maintain internally, because that can definitely be one of those things that bites you in the end. Is speaking all these different standards, that can sometimes be an operational burden. So for end users, I really think it's lower complexity, but it's also increased understanding.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Amy, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I have one other thing to add. To fully agree with, the limiting of exceptions and what that can do to the bottom line. But I think that standardization also can assist in understanding your partner, your customer's behavior. And so there are benefits to that, including risk management. So when there are standards for how a payment or the payment information looks and is entered, then we have a better understanding of what a payment is, what it is for. So in addition to some of the things like payment application, when we know what something is, we understand better how to treat it. And that can be then automated, so systematic treatment of that payment. But when we understand better of what our customers' expected behavior is, we can then also be able to better recognize what might be unexpected behavior. And so that assists us in our risk management efforts in both our customer service, trying to protect our customers, trying to protect our own accounts, but also in meeting, our legal and compliance obligations, which we're going to talk, some more about. That particularly comes in with, international transactions, but even just on the domestic level, again, when you know what you are expecting, it's easier to see those anomalies. And so standardization actually has a role to play in risk management as well.
Yeah, actually, a really relevant question just came through the chat. And I know we were supposed to wait till the end to address these questions, but I thought maybe we could just pop this one in. And in terms of like standardization, does that typically encompass all types of payment methods, credit, debit, wallets, buy now, pay later? Curious to get your guys' thoughts on that.
That's a really interesting question. Amy, I'm not going to speak for you, but I think my expertise a lot comes from bank-to-bank payments. So I'm hugely interested in bank-to-bank payments and the standardization there. I'm the first one to admit I don't know as much about credit cards. I don't know much about debit cards. From what I understand, there is a standard for those systems. I'm really gonna not have it correct right now, but I believe it's ISO 853 is the message standard for credit cards and debit cards for card networks in general. There is a standard there, but it's not really seeing the same levels of standardization that we're seeing in bank-to-bank payments. I think one of the themes we'll talk about later is that globally we're kind of inching towards a single standard in bank-to-bank payments, and you don't see that same momentum on the credit card side, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, I would just add, I totally agree with that. When you're talking about, the cards or the wallets, different types of payments, buy now, pay later might depend on the rails that it's riding. Each different network or rail has their own standard. And so in a certain way, yes, there's standardization, but to your point earlier, Sam, of, trying to minimize, how many different things you're coding to, you are most likely going to have to code to different specs based on the different types of payments that you accept. There is not, as you said, trying to create a payments hub it has proven to be very, very difficult, where it's completely payment agnostic, because and we're going to mention a little bit later, one of the challenges is, you do have to have somebody that's kind of keeping their ear to the ground to all of these different types of payment methods if you are going to play in that space.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think this is a good segue to talking about specific messaging standards. So let's switch gears and talk about ISO 20022. ISO has become a major consideration in standardizing payments data, particularly at a cross-border level. And so, Amy, I'm curious to get your perspective on how Nacha is thinking about ISO today.
Yeah, so we've been talking about ISO for decades now, really, but Nacha does have its own proprietary formats that, like, as I mentioned, have been around for 50 years. With, we continue to add and evolve as we need to. But at this point, we don't have any plans to move away from that. Nacha has been engaged in a process where every few years, 3 to 5, depending on kind of what's going on, we go out and partner with people that help us take a pulse on where the industry is. And so at this point within the United States, outside of just a very small handful of global facing companies, there really is not much understanding or usage of ISO happening today. In the United States, I should say. And so when it comes to the US domestic ACH network, where we are going to continue to focus our efforts are basically on translation or mapping guides. Not just had mapping guides out on our website for, it's going on about 8 years now, I believe, where we help financial institutions and their customers be able to understand how to translate either a payment file, so bringing one in from a customer, and how you can translate that as a financial institution into an ACH network file, and also sort of going the other way, being able to provide information on received transactions or returns or other kinds of reporting around those types of ACH transactions. We also did a couple of years ago, you can find on our website also a white paper about how we are starting to work with the operators as well as providers to show how ISO information can go through even an ACH formatted transaction. So that's really where we're focused on, where we are planning to continue to focus on for the next several years. There's been a tremendous amount of growth, especially since the pandemic, in B2B payments. A lot of organizations finally are making that last step from some of their paper processes over to electronics. B2B transactions in the ACH network are up about 11%, and that has been pretty steady over the last 18 months or so. And we're also seeing very large growth in same-day ACH, which is primarily also driven by B2B payments. And so there are so many small to medium-sized businesses that are just now moving into this electronic space. And so their minds, from what we've heard in our research, really are not quite on things like ISO at this point. They're still trying to get their arms around getting these efficiencies from moving over to electronics.
And Sam, any thoughts on why ISO adoption by businesses has been a bit slower than expected?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would call out that I think there's two ISO rollouts. There's the ISO rollout to businesses, and there's the ISO rollout to banks. I think Amy's right. Like, I think in the US, we're not, for businesses, for corporates, for the end users of these systems, ISO is not really that prevalent. And the reason why is because the networks themselves are just barely starting their migrations. I mean, if we look here in the US, Fedwire is going to switch over to ISO in March. CHIPS is going to do the same thing. FedNow launched last year with ISO. RTP launched a few years ago with ISO. So the standardization at the bank level is there. All the banks are using ISO or will use ISO very soon, even for SWIFT messages, which we're kind of in this dual translation period for a couple of years. In the vastness of time, maybe in the next 2 years, we'll see banks standardize on ISO quite a bit, and the rollout there will be fairly quick and fairly absolute. But for basically, how would I say this, trickling that down to end users, to corporates, I think that's where we've seen it stall out, because every interface that the bank exposes to their customers, to corporates, can be wildly different. I mean, modern Treasury has seen everything from proprietary XML files to fixed with text files that aren't Nacha based to all sorts of things. The ISO is some of them. So when a bank is exposing their interfaces to a corporate end user, you could have 10, 15 different file formats that you have to implement. And so that, we don't see the ISO migration there, largely because there's no need. I mean, for the most part, every payment rail had a different system that they were talking to each other with. And so the standardization benefit wasn't there. I think if we have this same webinar maybe a year from now, I think we won't be saying the same thing. I think businesses will start to catch up. But we're just in the middle or just at the start of that churn. It just hasn't happened yet.
Yeah.
I'd also just chime in and add a little bit about, I think, the unique size of the U.S. market. We have millions and millions of businesses that originate ACH payments. And then you couple that with the fact that have thousands and thousands of financial institutions, between 8,000 to 9,000 financial institutions in this country. And so while, yes, Fedwire's moved over and Swift, et cetera, these have been very long, implementations. When we're talking about millions of end users and thousands of financial institutions in a country of this size, that is a very, very, very big ship, aircraft carrier type, if you will, to be able to turn. And so with so many legacy systems between both, the financial institutions, adding in fintechs as well as the end users, that's a lot of change for something that is working very efficiently.
Yes,
Yeah.
these things take time. I think I'll call out that my first exposure to the eventual ISO migration of Fedwire and chips was at a Nacha conference, was at the Smarter, Faster Payments conference in Orlando, and I believe it was 2019. And every year after that was the same talk
Yeah.
about how we're about to migrate to ISO. And so this has been a almost 5-6 year journey. These things take time. Like Amy's absolutely right. Like the US has thousands of financial institutions, vastly more than other countries by a huge order of magnitude. And so any changes just take time to roll out. And there's a lot of different players involved, and you want it to be smooth and you want it to be slow because you want it to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Maybe this will be the year. We'll see. Cool. So Sam, obviously you know a lot about file formats and processes across Rails. Readiness aside, what is your take on how to better standardize payments information?
That's a really good question. Amy brought it up, which is AC in the Nacha file format for CTX records. There's a way to include standardized, structured remittance information. I think that's one of the first things that is really beneficial for businesses looking to standardize is how can we actually agree on standardized remittance information? Because right now, most payment systems, we have a free-form text field. For ACH, I have 10 characters. In the addenda, I have 80. For wires, I have 140 characters of unstructured, but the CTX records get you thousands of characters that I can use to essentially encode any structured information I want to about a payment. And I think one of the great things about ISO is that it does have you don't need to accept all of it. The ACH doesn't have to move fully to ISO for us to reap the benefits of it. One of those benefits being structured remittance information. And that's one of the things that I'm the most excited about is that businesses could potentially start using ISO as a remittance information format and start structuring their CTX messages to have that kind of information in it, because that is going to be a standard that Fedwire eventually supports and FedNow supports today, where if I can describe a payment that I'm paying, let's give an example. Let's say that I'm paying Amy because Amy invoiced me 3 times, and I'm paying off 3 different invoices with 1 payment. Inside of the structured remittance information, I can basically list out, hey, this is a payment for Amy. These are the 3 invoices I'm paying. And oh, maybe on this invoice, maybe I took a discount because I'm paying early. And so you can fully encode why a payment is being made inside of the message instead of having to email that out, instead of having to fax it somewhere. And having a standard for how that information is structured, hugely valuable for all the parties involved, really. So I'm very much excited about that. I think that's like the real first concrete step that businesses can start to take.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, what file formats are you most excited about at Nacha?
Well, just piggybacking on what Sam was mentioning there around the CTX format. So that's a B2B format, excuse me, that is very large. So he mentioned thousands and thousands. Specifically, you can have 9,999 addenda records carrying 80 characters. And so that's vastly bigger than any other type of payment system that is available. And so we have been talking about perhaps making some changes to some of our descriptions in, I'm getting super geeky here, but I'm talking about Appendix 3 of our rules, which really delves into our file formats. To reinforce what we say sort of in the first part of our rules, which is when it comes to B2B transactions, we don't have quite as many guide rails that we have to work within in terms of, sort of very specific things around authorization. The B2B side, we very much are encouraging of, number one, both parties have to agree to abide by the Nacha rules. But the second part is the rest of the agreement really is between the 2 parties. And so we want to do some updating to some of the descriptions and the formats today that speak about that information that can go into a CTX format. Right now, it's referencing some things like banking conventions or 820 kind of EDI information to really make it clear, as Sam was mentioning, that there are other ways that when both parties come to that agreement come to that standardization, that information can be carried within that transaction. A lot of people actually don't really know about the CTX transaction because a long time ago, when we were in a different kind of technology standard, data was more expensive depending on the amount that you had. But over the decades, we really are not in that kind of a space any longer. It really is no more expensive to be able to process or store a transaction with several addenda records versus none. So a lot of people are just now hearing about this capability within the ACH network. So really wanting to push that. Now that is a domestic transaction. And so the other thing that we are very excited about are what we call IATs, the International ACH Transaction. Nacha performs rulemaking through the industry. We go out to comment for comment periods. We solicit and encourage comments from anybody that participates in the network, and that's really when the best rulemaking is done, when we can get all different kinds of points of view and the input from those folks. So we are going to be going out with a request for comment as well as a request for information, which is a little less formal, asking some more questions of the industry around the formats of our international ACH transaction. And getting sort of taking the temperature and getting that input from the industry to determine, for example, if we have the right fields. Sam mentioned date of birth earlier. That is a field that we are proposing to the industry that we add in a formatted way into the IAT transaction, because we've heard that with up to 20% of IATs exceptioning out for manual review to make sure that we're not violating any laws, that's the number one field that people are able to use to clear those transactions. So by having a designated space within the ACH network for that, you actually are going to be able to lower that 20% exception rate. That's our whole goal, is we really need to get those exceptions down. And so that's something that a system can read and compare and help you with your decision making. But we're also going to be asking the industry, even beyond some of those things that were specifically designated in the request for information, request for comment. In the request for information, are there needs for additional fields or additional addenda records that might need to carry more information than what is designated today? And really even getting into standardization, because some of the records that we have for the IAT transaction today that are optionally appended based on certain circumstances, they are more of a, I don't want to call them free-form fields, but they fit many different circumstances, and so they are not as specifically formatted as some of the other addenda records. So we're very anxious and curious to hear from the industry around that kind of standardization or those needs around standardization for transactions that are flowing through the US and then internationally.
Yeah, and not to give you too much of a preview, Amy, into what our comments will be when that finally goes out, but I think this is one of the great things about ISO, is that it gives us the concepts that we can standardize around, and the actual syntax, we don't need to copy that. So in an IAT payment, we can take fields like date of birth, which is a standard, has a standard ISO representation, is in a lot of international payments. But we can also take other concepts like the ultimate originator or the ultimate receiver. Like if you have multiple parties in a payment beyond just the sender and receiver, you have the people you're making payments on behalf of and for the benefit of. Those concepts are a little bit more concrete in ISO, and so I think what we'll probably comment on, just from what we've seen in our experience, is those would be great fields to add to the IAT records, is standardizing the concepts that we see from ISO, even if we're not taking the syntax, even if we're not taking the file format. It's about standardizing the concept. I think of it a lot like these are just languages. And let's say that ACH is a language and it didn't have a word for the concept of a banana. But now finally, we see it in a different language like ISO. And so we're saying, oh, that's a good concept. We should have a word for that. And so we should copy that over. And I think that's maybe one of the things with payment standardization that is going to happen more in the future, is that we're going to take ideas from other systems and we all might converge in terms of concepts, even if our syntax and the actual language we speak is quite different, I think we're going to standardize around these base concepts that are important, especially for international payments.
And earlier, Sam and Amy, you both mentioned that it's taken a lot of time for some of these like legacy financial institutions to adopt payment standardization. I'm just curious to get your perspective on, are there any tactics or techniques that businesses can use to ensure a smooth transition from legacy type systems to standardized payment platforms? So love to get your thoughts on that. Yeah, I know this is a little off script, but yeah.
I mean, there's so many things that can be done, I feel like. When you're evaluating these kinds of systems, when you're looking to kind of go into a more standardized system, it has to be approached with a certain reason in mind. Like if you're going towards real time, for example, like if you're moving in the direction of instant payments, and because of that, you need to be a little bit more ISO friendly because, FedNow, RTP are a little bit more ISO friendly. Some of the problems you're going to face there are going to be around just updating all of your systems away from being batch-based to being more real-time. And so that takes a certain amount of internal understanding. But like Amy mentioned before, there's also just the syntax, like the system that you have to operate on. And so you have to essentially learn a new language and build support for a new language into your system. And even if it is ISO and that's different from the Nacha standard, you still have to speak all the concepts correctly because it's the network is dictating certain rules for certain fields. And so there's just a lot of, particulars, details that you have to get right. And I think that's the same for anyone who builds the system themselves, is you have to be on top of these things all the time because there are minute differences and changes. And one of the great things, I'm going a little bit off script here. One of the great things that I love about Nacha is the rulemaking ability. Like, I think Nacha is amazing for an organization to, over the past 50 years, have consistently updated their rules to keep up with the times and to accommodate new use cases and accommodate things like the internet, which, in the beginning of Nacha did not exist. And now we have a web SEC code for web transactions. So I think one of the great things there is that like these systems are changing and they change constantly. And you have to be aware of those changes in order to have a system that's built well. So I know I maybe didn't answer your question exactly, Kirsten, but those are the things that I think about when I think about changes, translations, moving systems over. Those are all things that you have to consider.
Mm-hmm. From the Nacha perspective, we often have conversations a little, sort of at the operational level with folks that are moving into electronic payments space. And one of the things that they do mention up front is that when they shift over to electronic payments from paper, they may have a reduction in, as Sam mentioned earlier, their straight through processing rate. So that's the number of payments that get applied without anybody having to touch them. And so with standardization, there is a little bit of a curve in the beginning where you need to work with your different partners, the folks that are either sending you payments or that you're pulling in payments from, to get both of you on the same standardization page so that everybody understands this is the standard, this is how we need the information to be formatted. So there are different things. It takes a little bit of extra work in the beginning to have those conversations with partners, make some of those decisions on, am I going to pull in all of my payments so I'm fully in charge of how everything is structured? Or if I have partners that are not as willing for me to be the one adjusting their payments and I'm going to accept payments being sent to me, how do I make sure that I'm communicating with my partner and incentivizing them to say, okay, here's the format that we agree on. Here's the standard. Yes, we're all going to do that. So that can be, sort of one of the challenges, but there are steps that can be done there, again, with different kinds of incentivizing behavior, carrots and sticks, etc. But once you sort of get over that hump or around that curve, I've never spoken to anyone who said it wasn't worth it. That all of a sudden that perhaps 25 to 30% reduction in straight through processing. Now that's gone. We're back up to our normal rates, and our customers and our own accounting staff are much happier as a result.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like going slow to go fast. Like doing that upfront legwork really helps in the long run and has enormous benefits to a business.
Mm-hmm.
I just PSA for folks who are on this webinar, if you have a question, feel free to pop it into the chat because in about 10 minutes, we're going to focus on the questions in the chat with the panelists. So yeah, if you have anything burning that you want to ask, please put it in the chat. Cool. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about like real world applications of payment standardization. And this question here is about how businesses can leverage standardized payment information to help streamline things like reconciliation, cash management, and reporting. And so, Sam, let's have you pontificate on this first and foremost, and then we can pass it over to Amy.
Yeah, I think I'm not going to say it's the only reason to standardize payments, but a huge reason that we're talking about payment standardization is this real world application of reconciliation, processing payments straight through, applying payments correctly. That's really at the end of the day what we're talking about. It's removing humans and exceptions from the loop. I should be able to send a payment to Amy, and I should be able to fully describe what that payment is for. And then Amy should be able to, potentially without a human, but with just a computer, understand what the payment is for and automatically apply it in the system. So let's talk about B2B payments, because that's a big growing thing, as Amy mentioned, for same-day ACH. A lot of payment rails too. A large amount of the volume, is our B2B payments. So if I get an invoice, or I get 5 invoices, 10 invoices, all with various things that I need to pay off, when I'm going to say, okay, I got all these invoices, I need to send payment to remit payment to pay off these invoices, with standards, I can say, I'm paying off these 10 invoices. I can put that in the payment message. I can send it to Amy. Amy's accounts receivable system can look at that payment, automatically see, okay, it's a CTX payment. I see all the structured remittance information in there. This $1,000 is paying off these 10 $100 invoices. And so Amy's computer can automatically apply the payment to the open invoice item and close it. And so without a human being in the loop, we basically have paid off and done the whole APAR cycle without anyone looking at anything manually, without looking at any exceptions. And when you start adding in banks in there and international payments, where banks do have to understand, why is this payment being made? Because they're trying to comply with international regulations, they need to comply with anti-money laundering laws. When a bank sees a payment, if they have all the information in there and it's standardized, then they're going to process that straight through. They're not going to fail it. They're not going to check it for exceptions. They're not going to return it to the sender. And so the value here is in the speed, but also just the processing straight through, getting humans out of the loop, and really just making payments be in the background, not having a human have to decision and do all these things. And it's a huge operations improvement. I mean, I triple agree with what Amy mentioned. No one says that it isn't worth it in the end. You get massive operational improvements from standardizing how you send and receive payments, because there are just knock-on effects in the entire industry. And you see it over and over again. Once you've automated these reconciliation processes, or you've automated AP and AR, it's just effortless. It flows in the background. It needs vastly fewer people to manage. And yeah, that's my pontification for the day. I think it's just a huge savings of resources that can be used elsewhere for things that are truly exceptional.
I think Sam covered that in a fantastic fashion. I think I would just summarize it by just agreeing that the faster that payments can be applied, they're not sitting in some GL somewhere as an exception, the faster the utilization of those funds can begin. And so that, also the other side of that is some lower staffing costs, because you don't have people researching as much. So yes, very much an improvement to the cash flow or the cash management process. There's some benefits to, again, looking at your days outstanding of sales, et cetera, where you can really gain some benefits and as you said, much more faster utilization of those funds
Mm-hmm.
as a result.
And not to be too doom and gloom, but let's pretend that you don't have any of this. I mean, modern Treasury has talked to people with this problem where if you don't have straight through processing or you don't have some kind of automated reconciliation system, Amy's right. You just have items hanging out on your GL. You don't know what the money is for. You could be accumulating massive problems that you don't know about because these things aren't reconciling. They're not being applied correctly and quickly. Your total, I guess, number of problems or the total dollar volume of your problems just keeps expanding because it grows faster than you can tackle it. And so for a lot of businesses, staying on top of this is essential because it's your money. It's the lifeblood of the business. You have to know what it's for. And the longer that you don't have it automated, the longer things hang out, the more opportunity there is for fraud or for people to, kind of take advantage of that. And so you see it over and over again that once these things are automated, it's kind of a weight off your chest, especially if you're in the finance team where, okay, I can trust that everything's going well and I don't need to constantly nitpick it and things aren't going to grow out of hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what about emerging technologies like AI, Sam? I'm curious to get your perspective on how AI technology could potentially impact payment standardization or play a role in payment standardization. Do you have any thoughts on that? I know that's a little off script, but
yeah, no, I'll say this a few ways, which is AI is good at some things and not so good at other things. And one of the things it's not so good at is, I wouldn't put an AI in charge of sending payments for a business. Like I wouldn't put the lifeblood of my business in the hands of an AI model and say, no, you decide when you send payments and for how much. That's not going to fly. Where I think AI is exceptional is in kind of the fuzziness and the understanding of human language. I think AI could serve as a great way to bridge this kind of unstructured, unstandardized world with the more standardized world that we want to see. As an example, let's talk about date of birth, just because we keep bringing that up. Right now, potentially, if I need to put a date of birth in a IET payment, maybe I'm putting that in the free-form, remittance information field on that IET payment. A AI model can, on the receiver side, can maybe read and parse that out and say like, hey, there isn't a standard yet for where you put the date of birth, but I see that you probably put it in this unstructured field, along with all these other things that got thrown in the unstructured field. AI is good at that kind of fuzzy matching, fuzzy logic, fuzzy parsing. And so I think with AI, you can get structured information out of unstructured fields. That does require some work and some training. There's always the possibility of there being an error. The benefit of having the standardized field is obviously everyone can agree on it and you don't need AI and everyone can just validate it correctly. But in this transition period, in this bridge, I think AI can get you to that point where you can start understanding how standards work and how it could be better. And so, yeah, I see it as a transitional tool there. For reconciliation, though, I'll go on a little bit more of a tangent. I see AI as being essential because AI can look at all of your payments, all of the transactions, all of the open items you have. And I think it's fantastic at being able to find enough comparisons to close an item for you. And so in reconciliation, I think AI is wonderful. But standardization, yeah, I think of this as a bridge.
Great. All right, so one last question before we transition to the Q&A. Want to wrap things up by asking about looking ahead at the future. So from both of your perspective, curious to understand what trends you see shaping payment standardization over the next 5 years. So Amy, let's start with you.
Okay. I would say, number one, I fully agree with everything that Sam just said around AI and the increase that that is going to have in being able to understand and read the remittance information, and the simplification that that's going to bring about, primarily because of standardization. When you have standardization, then it's going to get those guesses a lot more correct more often. And so I think that I see, when it comes to the US domestic market in the B2B space, I really see folks being able to take advantage of that CTX transaction. I think we're just going to continue to see, these double-digit trends like we have been the last couple of years. And again, not only just with the sending of the money, but because folks are realizing the benefit that the ACH network has to be able to send this data with the payment. That being said, I do think that on the international side, there may even be, I'm going to call it also a bridge, as Sam was, but looking at a little bit of reassociation. So we talked about the huge size of the market here in the U.S. We may put out this request for comment on the IAT formats, and folks may say, yes, we have these needs, but changing these legacy systems to accommodate this, it really is a huge lift. And maybe there are some bridges that we can take in terms of looking at APIs that could potentially send formatted information to reassociate with the IAT, sort of as a bridge to, making all of these changes, while everybody, we also have to be cognizant that financial institutions and originators are making these Fedwire changes, they're making these SWIFT changes, they're dealing with lots and lots of other things. And so I can kind of see where, we may be able to take advantage of some newer technologies, focusing again on translation and bringing that reconciliation together for folks.
Makes sense. Sam, any additional thoughts you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the future. I may have given it away too early in this presentation, but ACH isn't moving to ISO. There are lots of other standards around the world, like BACS in the UK, which also isn't moving to ISO. Like, a lot of these payment systems have a format that works well and that people like, and that it isn't going to change. It isn't going to change the syntax. But I think what we're going to see in terms of standardization is twofold. I think we're going to see things like the IAT records incorporating concepts that are maybe standardized in other areas. I think we're going to see that a lot more. I think we're going to see payment rails around the world start to standardize on concepts rather than standardize on syntax. And then for structured remittance information, I actually think maybe the opposite. They are going to standardize, I think, on syntax. One of the benefits of ISO as a structured remittance language is that it's very well defined, it's very rich, and it can be used today in all the free-form fields. You can stick an ISO message in there, and you can say, okay, this is just the remittance information. So I think over the next 5 years, I think we're going to see more systems standardize on ISO as the carrier for structured remittance information. And I think the payment messages themselves, I think we're going to all see kind of this hyper-convergence of standardizing on concepts. And I keep harping on ultimate originator and ultimate receiver, but those are concepts that are, starting to get more important for financial institutions to record and have a record of. And so I think those concepts are going to make their way into the individual payment rails and in whatever syntax that rail decides. So I think that's one of the ways that we're going to see payment standardization evolving.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Great. Thank you for those insights. Very interesting. So we're going to switch gears now and go to the questions in the Q&A. So first question is around fees. With adoption of ISO payment standardization, will or should fees decrease?
I'm gonna put on my my business hat first and say, whatever a bank charges is between you and your bank, and whatever the central bank charges you is between the central bank and the bank. And I don't necessarily see this payment standardization reducing or increasing fees in any way. But, and not to sidestep this question, I think the larger issue here is, what are the advantages I can get on my balance sheet by moving to standardization that are not, penny pinching on individual fees. Amy mentioned this. There's a substantial amount of payroll benefits that you can get, resource benefits by having fewer people involved in looking at payments, decisioning payments, looking over exceptional payments. If you focus on standardization, that's so many more resources you don't need. And if you buy software like Modern Treasury, that keeps going down. Like you might spend some amount of money on the software, but the benefits you get back and sort of resources back, people that you don't need anymore, I think vastly outweighs any difference that you would see if the fees were just slightly lower. So that's my take on it. Amy, I don't know if you have thoughts.
Yeah,
about
no,
that.
I am going to sidestep the question a little bit. I got to be careful of antitrust and things of that nature. But what I was thinking is exactly as you said. It's really more of the operational efficiencies and cost savings that you're going to realize in those manners.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. All right, next question is, does fraud increase or recovery efforts decrease since the payments do not sit as they are processed near real time? So
I'll take a first stab at this. Okay. Yeah, I'll take a first stab and then curious to see what Sam has to say. So from the ACH perspective, one of my coworkers and I were having a conversation the other day, and he came up with the term that the ACH is the optimal speed because you've got same day ACH, which significantly can, or decrease, I should say, the amount of time that it takes to process and make available payments. But there are enough steps with some minimal amounts of friction in there that can still allow for, and our rules are requiring, and even more so in the next couple of years, requiring all parties to be able to do those risk management checks. So having that standardization, as I was mentioning before, that can allow for the computer or the system to be able to do that for you, at a very successful level because it understands what it's seeing and can recognize what looks weird to it, really is beneficial in taking advantage of those pockets of time that within the network you have, where you can still do your risk mitigation, but again, your standardization is going to help you do that more quickly. So Sam, I don't know if you want to speak more on the real time side of that.
No, I'll agree with you there. And yeah, I would summarize it as, if you have more standardization in your payments, it is, like Amy mentioned, much easier to see the weird ones from the not weird ones. And the weird ones are, potentially more fraudulent. And, speaking about a real-time nature, if you have a computer identifying the payments, because it can read the structured information and make a decision very quickly, you're going to see in more real time which payments are potentially fraudulent or not, much more easily and much more quickly. And you're going to get a lot less false positives and potentially false negatives, because the more information about it, the easier it is for a financial institution or a corporate to see this seems weird, or this seems strange, or this is different. And so I think in general, like, you're going to get faster at detecting fraud the more data that is present in a payment, the more standardization you have about a payment. That's maybe a too overarching a statement, but generally I feel like that's the right direction. Is it's going to be better with more standardization, not less. You're not going to have more fraud because you have more data in a payment.
Awesome. So I think there's one last question on here, and the question I think is around having IAT and CCD standards align more with BSA requirements. So I'm just curious if you guys have any general thoughts on that. Is there a move towards aligning with BSA requirements over time?
Well, and so I think that because the question is around ACH formats. So from the CCD, I think that it goes back to what I was saying before. A lot of people are not aware of the CTX transaction. So the CCD transaction that only carries a max of one 80-character remittance record, or addenda record, as we call it. That works best when, you know, you are partners, you're perhaps sending these transactions, you know, weekly, you're only paying one invoice, you know, things of that nature, where it's going to, you know, that technology, that risk management system, you know, is going to recognize this. Okay, this is normal. I'm getting this weekly. I don't, you know, need as much information. Whereas when you are perhaps transacting less often with a partner, things may, you know, suspect out and things of that nature. And so, yes, the purpose of the payment is definitely something that can help to help folks when they're looking either from an AML perspective or OFAC perspective, et cetera. And so that may be when you want to use that CTX format. And you can carry some more information. With the IAT, it is true, we have sort of limited space at this point. We do have a 3-character code that does talk about the purpose of the payment. And then we've got a couple of optional remittance records that can go as well. And so perhaps it's, you know, understanding, you know, okay, how large really can I make the IAT transaction? But it is also going to depend on things like Sam has mentioned. Do you have ultimate beneficiaries or senders that you need to include in there? And so this is something we will be interested in hearing back from the RFI process. I kind of mentioned something earlier and around sort of a reassociation model. Nacha does have another sort of an arm to our business called Fixius, where we did implement an API. Now, again, both financial institutions have to, you know, accept the API, but that part of the purpose of the API was to be able to send ISO formatted remittance, either unstructured or structured remittance information, to help answer that question of the purpose of the payment, you know, for potential compliance purposes. So yeah, there's, you know, there's work to be done potentially on the IAT side, either through education or maybe some expansion. But like I said, I think that the understanding the benefit of the CTX over the CCD can definitely help that domestically.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in to say that, you know, we have a lot of things for that request for comment when that comes out. One of them is ISO has a semi-structured way of reporting regulatory requirements, and so there's some ISO way of saying like, hey, this code is necessary for this country in order to process the payment. And I think ISO has a way of essentially structuring that down into a way that is easy to report. That might be one of those things, which is beyond the 3 characters in the IAT field, you might need a country identifier and you might need a free-form text field after the country identifier that says, okay, this is something that makes sense in that country. And so you know, there's more concepts that I think we can take from other standards. That would be one of them, to kind of give more, I don't know, essentially always those are purpose fields. And so this would kind of give more flexibility to describing the purpose of the payment in a country where maybe that's required.
Great. So we're almost at time, but we have one last question that's come through. Any thoughts on system performance bottlenecks after introducing ISO messages? Have you seen that happen?
It really depends on your individual system. To be honest, I've not seen a slowdown or a speed up. If you're dealing with files already, the ISO messages incurred no additional overhead, in my experience. In some ways it can be quicker sometimes, some ways it can be slower because there's much more text than in an equivalent Nacha message. So it really depends on your individual system. For the bottlenecks, I would just say that in the more real-time systems that use ISO, like FedNow and RTP, you have to make sure that you're not conflating the more, you know, batch-based systems like wires and ACH with things that need to actually be real-time, where you need to send one message and be done. The great thing about a Nacha file is that I can include many payments and include a lot of different information in the file. But generally, when I'm sending a FedNow message, I'm only sending a single payment, and so I'm trying to serialize out just a single message. You just don't want to conflate the two, and so you just want to make sure that you are sending only a single message and as quick as you can, because that's kind of the benefit of instant payments.
Great. So I think that's all we have for today. I want to thank our panelists, Sam Aarons and Amy Morris, for joining us. I think this was a really interesting conversation. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out a recording of this chat in a few days. And I want to just say thank you once again.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.